Hello, everyone, and welcome to We Intend to Move On Your Works, a podcast where we take a look at games about the American Civil War. My name is Alexandre Fontaine-Rousseau, and I am joined today by Stuart Ellis-Gorman and Pierre Wagner-Jones, and we are taking a look at Army of the Heartland, a game designed by the late John Prados and published in 1996 by Clash of Arms Games, with art by the great Rick Barber. First of all, hello to the both of you.
Hello.
Hello.
It's been a while since we've been able to record one of these, and I'm glad we're kicking it off with a game by John Prados, who died in November 2022. Prados is an interesting figure. He's generally considered the premier historian of the CIA. He has written a lot about the Vietnam War, and he was an active member of an association called the Vietnam Veterans Against the War. He was said to have, according to his partner, an avid enjoyment of wargaming and a deep loathing for war itself. And his first game, Year of the Rat, which was published in 1972 and designed in collaboration with Jim Dunnigan, was about Vietnam. And when you think about the fact that it was 1972 and that he was already designing a game about Vietnam, I think it tells you something about him as like an intellectual and a game designer. And as somebody who took gaming seriously from the get-go at the time where maybe it wasn't taken seriously. And he seems to be one of those designers who could think outside the box. He designed a game titled Cold War in 1984, so that's years before Twilight Struggle. But we're here to talk about Army of the Heartland, which focuses on conflicts in Kentucky, Tennessee, and Georgia, from 1861 to 1863. Stuart, can you tell us a little bit more about the situation here on a historical level?
Of course I can. That's what I'm here for.
I know you are. Yeah. It was a trick question, and the only good answer was yes.
You've activated my trap card. When last we spoke, we were covering the end of 1862 and Fredericksburg and kind of tiptoeing our way towards Chancellorsville. We were playing Rebel Fury. For this episode, we're jumping back in time and across Appalachia to the Western Theater. So last time we were in the West was with our Shiloh Palooza, where we played our 3 games on Shiloh. So we're going to have to go back a ways. If you don't recall, Shiloh was in early April of 1862, when Albert Sidney Johnston surprised Grant, who was planning an offensive into Mississippi, and then managed to get himself killed and lose the battle. So good job, Albert Sidney Johnston. Following on from the victory at Shiloh, the Union Army spent some time recovering, and then General Halleck took command directly over Generals Grant and Buell, who had won the Battle of Shiloh, and we will recognize from then, as well as John Pope, who we might remember will later be sent east and lose the Battle of Second Bull Run when we played Stonewall Jackson's Way. Mm-hmm. But he hasn't done that yet. Right now he's still in the West. So this campaign, the target was the rail junction of Corinth, Mississippi, which is in fairly northern Mississippi, major rail junction, just like rail crossroads town, and basically due south of Shiloh. So they didn't get going until the end of April. Halleck would later be criticized for how slow this campaign was. They left on the 29th of April, and they didn't get to Corinth until the 30th of May. It took them a full month to march, not a very long distance. But after the defeat in Shiloh, the Confederacy wasn't in a great position to really stop them, so there is some skirmishing and some small battles in this campaign, but it's basically a steamrolling Union army that goes down and takes Corinth, and the Union would control Corinth for the rest of the war. There was a brief attempt in October by Confederate General Van Dorn to retake it, and General Rosecrans basically drove him off at the Second Battle of Corinth. But with Corinth captured, the western half of Tennessee was largely secured under Union control. And at around this same time, Admiral Farragut, someone we won't spend enough time talking about because there's not many naval games on the American Civil War. But Admiral Farragut had captured New Orleans in one of his great victories, and then sailed quite a far up the Mississippi River, capturing forts along that way, basically failing to capture the city of Vicksburg, in part due to its fortifications and in part due to the river actually not being really deep enough for his sea vessels to effectively operate. But that meant that combined with Grant's earlier river campaigns with Fort Donelson and the other forts north of Vicksburg, that kind of left one defensive point on the Mississippi that the Confederates still controlled. Now, Vicksburg is a hell of a thing, and we'll spend some time talking about it again. But after the capture of Corinth, General Halleck gets sent east to become the commander of overall overall the Union war effort on the 23rd of July, because McClellan has landed in the peninsula, and we've talked about the peninsula and the changing of command there. No kind of similar leader was put in charge to oversee the whole Western Theater at this time. Halleck, being the overall army commander, was kind of assumed to be good enough. So there are 3 Union armies operating in what we consider the Western Theater, which, just a reminder, is between basically Appalachia and the Mississippi River. And everything beyond the Mississippi is called the Trans-Mississippian Theater, and it tends to be pretty minor. So they're the Army of the Mississippi, the Army of the Ohio, and the Army of the Tennessee. And it's worth noting something about how these armies are usually named, because Union armies are generally named for rivers. There are some exceptions. Pope would actually command the Army of Virginia, but mostly they're rivers. The Army of the Potomac, Army of the Tennessee. This gets a little confusing at times in the Western Theater because the Confederacy names their armies mostly after states. So you have the Army of Mississippi and the Army of Tennessee. So you have the Army of the Mississippi is fighting the Army of Mississippi. And that kind of stuff,
and trademarks hadn't been invented yet, had they? Yeah, that copyright wasn't a thing yet. So.
That kind of sitting on a name and trying to claim it, you got the URL down. So
that's what the war was really about.
It's the SEO, like the Army of the Mississippi has won. That's all they're looking for. Like whichever one it is, it doesn't matter.
After the flight from Corinth, a large portion of the Confederate armies in the West went to Vicksburg and set up in fortifications there. And Grant and the Army of the Mississippi would basically spend most of 1862 trying to take Vicksburg. And we'll talk about when Grant ultimately succeeds in 1863, because it's one of the most famous campaigns, maybe in American military history. But in 1862, he largely is trying everything he can to take it, including frontal assaults through the swamp, trying to get around through various tributaries with his boats. None of it really works. There's a blind swords game called Prelude to Vicksburg that I haven't played that came out, I think, last year, that actually covers one of these battles, because usually there's nothing on them. They're pretty disastrous, because Vicksburg is just like this. It's on a hill in a swamp. It's like the worst thing to attack.
And the best thing to defend.
The best thing to defend. Yeah. I'm going to skip over quite a lot here because we have to cover about 8 months of Western theater, and
that's a lot.
Not a lot of it is that consequential. There is a lot of little stuff that happens, but a lot of it isn't that consequential. So the next kind of big campaign comes in the August. And the Confederacy decided to take the initiative and launch an offensive, and they chose, obviously, the best man for the job, Braxton Bragg, one of the most underwhelming generals of the war.
Such a good name, though.
Yeah, great name. Very Stan Lee name, Braxton Bragg with the first same matching initials. It's great.
It's so American as well. From my point of view, it's so American.
It's a caricature of an American name.
Yeah, it does feel like he's a British cartoon of America, actually.
Yeah.
Exactly, yeah.
Johnny Yank and Braxton Bragg. So Bragg and his Army of Mississippi, which would later be renamed Army of Tennessee, which is kind of relevant to the game we're playing because it is Army of Tennessee is in the title of the game. He gathered his army in Chattanooga, Tennessee. So that was kind of in August, September, and then in early October, he launched an invasion into Kentucky. He kind of 2 hopes for this campaign. One of them was to draw the Union Army away from Chattanooga, because that was clearly their next target. So kind of by attacking into them, he hoped to draw them into their own territory rather than letting them attack him. And he also kind of thought he could liberate Kentucky. He had the same kind of mistaken belief that Lee had when Lee was invading Maryland, that would eventually become the Battle of Antietam, and that they thought they would be welcomed as liberators and heroes, that the people would rise up, because Kentucky was also a slave state. So they thought the people of Kentucky were held under the yoke of Union oppression, and that once he invaded, they would give him arms, they would rise up, and Kentucky would become part of the Confederacy. That didn't happen. Kentucky had initially declared itself neutral in 1861, and then had basically swung increasingly pro-Union throughout 1862. So by the end of 1862, it was a staunchly pro-Union state, and at the same time, they just saw the person who was invading them as the problem. So very quickly, it became apparent that the Kentuckians were not going to help him. So Bragg's campaign basically turned into a raid. Don Carlos Buell was leading the Army of the Ohio in this kind of section of the Western Theater, and he and Bragg basically engaged in a cat and mouse chase, where Bragg was marching through, raiding and capturing small garrisons, and Buell was kind of following along, trying to pin him down. Eventually, they fought the Battle of Perryville, which is a very weird battle. Also a blind swords game on it called Grand Havoc.
Yeah.
It's very good.
All of the weird battles at a blind swords game.
Yeah. But the weird thing about Perryville, that, in short, is basically that Buell didn't know it was happening. Braxton Bragg managed to get like it's kind of a narrow Union victory, in part because like half the Union army just stands there while it happens because they just can't
Yeah.
hear it. And so
Yeah, there's a rule
it.
for it. I read the rules
Yeah.
and I in that game, and I was like, oh, that's
Has Buell
interesting.
noticed the battle yet?
Yeah.
Basically, it's a minor Union victory, but it should have been like basically the opinion was that they should have annihilated Bragg. Lincoln was really annoyed with Buell for this. You know, Buell was a classic, not aggressive enough general for Lincoln's book. So he was fired and replaced by General Rosecrans, and Buell basically wouldn't hold a command for the rest of the war. Meanwhile, Jefferson Davis just really liked Braxton Bragg, which kind of explains why he just sticks around, even though he's not very good. So he was kept in charge of the now renamed Army of Tennessee, not the Tennessee. Then there's kind of another lull, very classic American Civil War lull. And in December, General Rosecrans, who's kind of moved up from Corinth now, where he had been because he just won the Battle of Corinth, took a position in Nashville, Tennessee. And Bragg had kind of gone through the mountains and taken up his strong position in Murfreesboro on the Stones River. Rosecrans began his campaign on the 28th of December, an unusual deep winter campaign. Not the norm, basically ever. But certainly not in the American Civil War. And the two armies met at Murfreesboro on New Year's Eve, 1862. The Battle of Murfreesboro, or Battle of Stones River, classic naming dispute, are you river or are you town, lasted until the 2nd of January. It was fought through freezing temperatures and, at times, icy rain. Absolutely miserable. And Rosecrans achieved a narrow victory, driving Bragg from Murfreesboro. But the battle was shockingly bloody. About 30% of both sides were casualties. It was, at the time, the bloodiest battle of the war. It exceeded both Shiloh and Antietam. Bragg was basically blamed for his defeat by the Confederacy, although he would stick around for a while. And it gave, even if it's a narrow victory, it gave the Union a victory, which was a huge morale boost, both for the armies in the West, who were largely more successful in this phase of the war anyway, but also, you know, if you compare it to the almost simultaneous disastrous defeat at Fredericksburg, which happened earlier in the month, this kind of meant that at the start of 1863, morale was high. There was a feeling of victory in the air for the Union. There you go.
All right, so now that we've spent so much time talking about the history, I think that what we need to make clear is that Army of the Heartland is very much a sandbox type game, which means it's not set on rails, which also means that it can divert pretty drastically from the way events unfolded historically. And I don't think we've talked about something quite like that yet in this series. And I'd really like to hear your personal opinions on this larger debate in the historical gaming community. Are you cool with a game allowing you to steer away from history as long as it makes sense?
Well, I see a lot of games that let you do that. They tend to be on a sort of more strategic scale, I find. Maybe more zoomed out, where you're not really looking at individual troop movements in a specific area, but you're more looking at sort of the direction a nation is going and things like that. And I really enjoy games like that. I think it's fun. Bit of sandbox to let you sort of be quite creative. I haven't played many games at this scale, at an operational scale, that has a lot of that gives you a lot of the reins on how to approach a certain situation. There's a lot of space to move in this game, which is why we say that it's more of a sandbox game. Like, the map is huge and the counter density on the map itself is pretty low. You've only got a handful of sort of leaders rather than individual troops on the map. So you can really easily flank around or go through certain mountain passes or decide to defend a certain city. And yes, like, the victory conditions play into this to enable this a lot, but I really enjoyed it. Now, I think it's interesting that it lets you do it, in that clearly John Prados thought that this was the way to sort of model this conflict, was to give you that amount of freedom, because the generals had that amount of freedom, is the implication, right? And then you can copy them word for word if you want, but what with the activation system, that you probably can't, but that's fine in my eyes, as long as it's possible to sort of emulate the history, but also sort of feasibly do something different. Why not? What about you, Stuart? What do you think?
I generally like sandbox games. I think they're a lot of fun, and I think it's another really interesting way to look at history. The kind of pitfall that I worry about with them usually is that sometimes history's got people doing stupid things, and if don't want your because you're playing it with hindsight, so you know if someone made a mistake, like this was a bad strategy and this is not the strategy you should do, then sometimes like a sandbox has no way to kind of evoke the history or put you in the shoes of it. I think something like I think the Levy and campaign games are a very interesting example of something that's very sandboxy, and I think sometimes you struggle to get into the mind of like why would a medieval commander do something like attack someone and risk a battle, because battles are really risky. And so that kind of aspect is a tricky part to capture. But if you can nail it, and games do, that it gets your incentives right, that like why you would want to do certain things. And that sometimes comes down to things like victory conditions being really cleverly structured. They can be a great way to like really dig into like kind of the bigger picture of how, not just like how a campaign works, but how campaigning worked. What would be your concerns if you were planning a campaign? If you were the guy in charge, like General Lincoln has said, I want you to take the city, figure it out. Then that's really interesting, and it can provide a very different kind of insight. It can be quite tricky to fine tune it, and that might be something we talk about, the degree to which Army of the Heartland is or isn't fine tuned with systems like, you know, how the rail network works, how moving on rivers would work and stuff like that, like all these systems. Because if one of them is out of whack, it can have really extensive knock-on problems where suddenly
and
like
a lot of levers you can pull.
If like boats, or if your boat system is wrong and suddenly people can be like doing Normandy in 1863, then like your sandbox kind of collapses to a degree.
No,
So
there's something fragile about a sandbox game. But also there's something potentially historical about sticking too closely to history and not giving you, as you said, the possibility to sort of like have the decision space that someone in that position would have.
And I think that certain mechanics really sort of lend themselves to that. Where in this game, I think the good mechanic, sort of air quotes, is for me the activation not being certain for each unit. That really helps you sort of get into that mindset of why did that general just sort of mill around on that, like behind that hill, and not move forwards? You know, why didn't they just sort of move his allotted movement points of 3 to go over the hill? And when you can inject a bit of that uncertainty at the start of the turn, you might be like, oh, okay, I'm just going to flank around to the west here and then attack behind him whilst I sort of coordinate with my other general to attack here. And you flank around to the west, and then your other general doesn't activate. And then that's quite fun and interesting and almost immersive to that sort of sandbox. And I think that works. If it's perfect information isn't the right term, but if it's something like Levian Campaign, which I love the system, I think it's amazing, but that is a lot more almost abstract with the movement, where it's kind of chess-like, because you know how far someone can move. You're going to be moving. It's about when they activate rather than like how far. And you know for certain if you've put this person's card at the top of your deck, they are going to activate at this certain time, and you're going to be able to move them. Obviously, Levian Campaign does a lot more interesting stuff.
And the situation might change, so it's not exactly.
Course.
I mean,
but you know, I think having a bit of that total randomness rather than like the counterplay of like what are they going to do and how am I going to react is quite interesting, and does lend itself to interesting situations in this sort of sandbox context.
The little thing that I like the most, and maybe we're getting slightly into other parts of the game, but the little rule that I adore and it feels very small, is that when you move adjacent to an enemy unit and you move into their Zoc, you have to try and declare an attack. And declaring an attack is a random result. Every general has a battle rating, and you have to roll a d6 and roll under their battle rating to succeed in declaring an attack. But then you don't actually attack. You have declared an attack, and you mark that they're going to attack, and then you keep doing your movements. Because if you can attack a single army multiple times in a turn, then each subsequent combat gets a column shift in their favor. So if you can hit them from multiple hexes, but that means each one of them has to make their d6 roll. So that's like, first of all, like a amount of chaos in determining whether or not battles are going to happen, which I like. But it also, like, it really messed with me a bit, because I think it's so easy to think of like, I'm just going to move units adjacent to the enemy as like a blocking maneuver or positioning. Like, I just want to be in this hex, but then that hex is next to an enemy general, and my general sucks at declaring attacks. And like,
but then so do mine, right?
Yeah.
So it's like,
and if they fail, if you fail to declare an attack, you take a step loss and lose a point of morale and have to retreat. It's brutal. Like, fucking failing to attack is horrible. So it's like, it really changes the math about how you think about where you're going to position your armies and where they can position their armies. Because also they're like, well, this guy has a terrible battle rating, so he probably isn't actually going to be able to be that aggressive. But maybe he can be. Maybe today is the day that Braxton Bragg rolls a 1 and makes an attack.
But exactly, and that did happen at one point, didn't it? And like, he did manage to actually attack, and that feels like, oh, that's weird, but also cool. You know, like that wasn't expected, but like it can happen, and it's not something that can happen or like did happen, so it will happen every time. It's really unlikely, but it's quite fun. I think that feeling really shines.
That sounds really interesting.
Yeah, the feeling of it really gets to you, and you feel like you're trying to give orders to these generals, and also you really feel that like you are risking a lot by taking an aggressive position and putting yourself in like moving up to attack someone. It's not just like, oh, I'm going to be next to you staring at you from my army. It's not, once they get close enough, they have to try and fight, and if they fail, something bad happens to you. So, and sometimes like making a bad attack is actually better than not making the attack in the first place, because the punishment for failing is so bad.
Yeah, that all sounds fascinating. Yeah. I guess the one system I naturally think about as a logical point of comparison for this is GCACW, the Great Campaigns of the American Civil War, because of the scale, obviously. Now, we've talked about GCACW in a previous episode, so if people want your thoughts on this system, they could just check that out. But do you think it's a valid reference point when talking about Army of the Heartland?
I think for my initial impression when we first played was yes, absolutely. I think I saw a lot of GCACW in this. Rolling to move, that sort of thing. You know, it's not the same mechanic where you're actually literally rolling 2 dice to like have that number of move, but there is a roll to move mechanic. The Confederates move faster than the Union. You know, like all these things on the surface, absolutely, I thought was, and like the scale as well feels similar. But I think Stuart has something else to this point, because yeah, it's really similar. But Stuart's recently been playing a different system.
I think there are a lot of the similarities. Like you say, there is a roll to move system, although Army of the Heartland, I think we'll talk about it more, uses this like very big grid, which is mental. And it could definitely be simpler. Much as I love it, it could definitely be simpler.
But it's very
We don't play war games for simplicity. Come on.
GCACW has a roll to make an attack system in it, because when you declare an assault, you do have to make a roll to see it, and there's just rolling for grand assaults. But it isn't like you can move adjacent without. You actually have to move adjacent, and then the next activation declare the attack. And there isn't that horrible punishment for fucking it up. Your worst result is that you actually just attack without all your units, rather than like you just take a step loss and have to retreat. So the degree of punishment to it is very different, and the dynamic feels different. And I think it's interesting as a comparison just to note, because we haven't said it, but Army of the Heartland is the second game in this series. The first was the Campaigns of Robert E. Lee, which was released the same year as Lee versus Grant, which is Joseph Balkowski's game with Victory Games that is the precursor to GCACW. These are systems that are kind of happening around the same time.
1988. I think.
Yeah, they came out in 88, and then in the kind of gap between Army of the Heartland and Campaigns of Robert E. Lee is when GCACW first comes out. I think Stonewall Jackson's Way is like 92, 93.
Yeah.
These are very much kind of, I think, happening. I wouldn't say they're directly inspiring each other, but it does feel like they must be to some degree in conversation with each other.
Yeah.
You know, like
In conversation seems like the right term.
So they share those elements, but I think really it is just the roll to move and the certain amount of chaos about whether or not you're going to fight. That's the only real thing that feels similar about them. To me, the system that really, which is another early 90s operational system, is Dean Essig's Operational Combat Series.
You mentioned that earlier. Not earlier in the podcast, but you've told me that, and I was excited because we've been playing OCS for a while. And I gotta say, John Prados was said to design war games not to breed militarism, but to reveal the difficulty of conducting war and its horrendous cost on a human and material level. And when I read that, I couldn't help but think of my experience with OCS, because what struck me when I first played OCS was the immediate impact the supply system had on my way of perceiving every single engagement, every single attack. The fact that you need to invest specific resources in order to conduct an attack means that all of a sudden there's a weight to that decision that you don't get in other X and counter war games, where it's just like it's sort of like almost free if you have like a supply line that's really abstract.
Alexander, you do get that in this. We have specific resources. You got morality resources. You got all these things that play off each other.
That's awesome, because that's when I played OCS. That was the revelatory aspect of that system. Was like now there are consequences. They're described in material terms, but it's easy as a player to stretch it and just like you now feel every conflict, like every single engagement, as a sort of like human and material investment.
Army of the Heartland doesn't like mechanically replicate OCS, but it does feel like they are tackling similar issues or have similar perception on what matters. OCS is a much, 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 much cleaner game, I will say. Army of the Heartland. So you play with these big side maps, and we'll talk more about the physical game later. But each general. So one of the things that has a huge hidden movement component that the others don't really have. OCS kind of has its complicated stacking rules where you can only see the top of a stack. But in this, like, you have a general on the map, and then all the general's units are going to live on an off-map display that your opponent usually can't see.
And any sub-generals within the general unit.
And sub-generals based on who the most senior general is. But each general has to track how many guns they have, how much ammunition they have for those guns, what is the army's morale level, which will give DRMs in combat, how many admin points that general has, and you have to spend admin points. You can spend them for a couple things. One of them you have to do is you have to spend an admin point to declare an attack, to try and make that attack roll. If you don't, you get +2 to the DRM on that roll where you're rolling a D6 under your stat, which is very bad because your guy is probably just a 4.
Yeah.
The senior generals can spend admin points to loan some of their stats to subordinate commanders, like giving them their battle or movement stats. There's a whole system with war effort points that you spend to swap generals in and out. Like at one point, Pierre won a battle, but I shot his general and basically gave him a really bad wound. And so he had like -5 to his movement rating. He couldn't move. And he recovers 1 point a turn, and it was a 3-turn campaign. So he had to replace him.
It was so interesting. But it was so interesting because I demolished you in that battle. Like, it was a crushing blow. And if I could have followed up on it, I think I would have just won the scenario there and then. But because like I crushed him and then he had to like retreat 2 steps away, 2 hexes away, and then I couldn't move to chase after. Like, that felt really like Stuart could regroup and sort of he knew that
everybody wants to attack, but the general's been shot in the gut and he can't move. Like
he doesn't know what's going on. He can't read the maps.
It can happen. It can happen. It can totally happen.
All of those systems then made me think a lot about like the game is like in tracking your resources and you can spend admin points to get more ammo at the end in the turn during the admin reset phase, and you need to have you can only bring certain numbers of guns,
than OCS.
And so there is a lot of like little stuff to track. And
we say granular. It sounds fancy.
It's granular.
It's very granular. It's a granular system.
To be fair to it, I wouldn't say elegant is the right word, but I think it does handle it. And especially on Vassal, I felt like I wasn't lost after the teach, which Stuart did very well, but didn't take that long. I didn't have the rulebook because there's no online version of the rulebook, so I was learning from Stuart's copy of the rules halfway across the world. So it was playable and it was doable, and I could, once you're playing and into it, you do remember like, oh, okay, this generals and with his army is underneath this general stack, and these are their rough resources. It's a lot, but because you'll only have maybe 7 or 8 generals to think about, and it's a big map, it's doable. Like, I'm not saying it's easy or elegant, but it's really not a sort of like complete like, oh, it's unplayable sort of feeling, you know, like it's still nice.
I would say
Possibly because it feels logical.
Yeah. Well, I would say that. I would say that that's accurate. Definitely.
the clunkiness in the design kind of comes from the fact that OCS feels like it's laser focused on on the supply system. And I was actually, there's another shared element in this, in that there is a lot of considerations for trace supply, and being in supply and being out of supply is very bad. And you drop supply depots that function like extenders in OCS. So it has also this element of like making sure that everything's in supply and like trying to go around and cut people's supply. But where OCS
and because you have that sort of freedom,
OCS feels very like hyper focused on that. Like that is the OCS knows that's the core of its game. Army of the Heartland, I think that is the core of the game, but it has just so much other stuff
it doesn't know it.
going on. It's trying to kind of be all things to all people. And I think some of it suffers from the fact that it's trying to be this 1861 to 63 game, which includes tons of really different campaigns. Like the 1861 stuff is really weird because those are river campaigns where the Union is moving on boats to take forts, which honestly demands very different priorities to something like the 1863 scenario, which is the one we didn't play because that's the grand campaign, and would have taken forever. But that feels like that was actually like what Prados most wanted to do. And there isn't even a vassal mod scenario for that, because the vassal mod is nice, but it doesn't have all the scenarios in it yet. I actually populated one of the scenarios we played by doing the setup by hand in Vassal.
God intended.
Those kind of the river rules and stuff feel very much, you're like, you had to put all these in because in some of these campaigns there were these river campaigns, but actually this game would have been better if we just didn't have to deal with this. In the same way that, like, you know, when OCS is like, okay, doing massive amphibious landing, a lot of people are like, this is not what the game is for.
I'd rather not.
Like people always say that about like Sicily too. They're like, play the scenario where you've already landed on Sicily. It's much easier, you know. And it's like,
I feel like
that's not the focus.
It's an obvious pull to do that though, where like you've got this map, it's a huge map, and all of these campaigns happened on this map. Why not, you know, try and make it all fit? And I think that might have been what was going through potentially John Prados' mind, potentially just Clash of Arms' mind, the publisher, you know. Like maybe they were pushing for that. I don't know. But I see the appeal.
But I appreciate that sort of ambition, because I really enjoy when you play different things on the same map, and it sort of means that like your brain is, oh, this happened here and this happened there. And there's something to be said about these overly ambitious games that might like take a bite that's larger than what they can actually chew.
That's very true. And also I find that specifically in this sort of field of operational war games, in the sort of genre of operational war games, what's on the market is usually an operational war game is about one battle. And then the different scenarios, if it does offer different scenarios, are the small beginner one, which is the first couple of hours, the medium one, which is
or
the first day, and then the massive one, which will take you 7 days of complete playing to play through. Whereas this does have different battles and different characters and different people going throughout, and that's quite interesting as a sort of product just on its own. You know, like in the operational wargame space, you don't often see that. That it's just totally different campaigns in the same box.
It's interesting. You can play like Shiloh and Corinth and all those in the game.
Yeah.
Which we didn't do. To say what we actually played, we played about like a couple turns of Bragg's invasion of Kentucky, and I got really sick. And when we restarted again, we had to we'll just restart from scratch. So we played Stones River, which is, if people do want to play Army of the Heartland, I think Stones River is probably the best scenario to start with, because it's only like 3 or 4 turns, which is a nice amount to kind of, I mean, we played it in like 3 hours or something. Like it doesn't take that long.
Maybe 4 hours, but I think it was fine.
Yeah, like 2 sessions for us anyway. So pretty quick. And you got a nice flavor for how the system works. It sets you up with a pretty clear set of goals. Like we're not that far apart, you know, Nashville to Murfreesboro. We're in Tennessee. It's not super far, you know, campaign, do the attacks. And also you get the weather rules in effect because it's winter. I don't know. The rulebook says the weather rules are optional, and it is insane to me because the weather rules only apply in winter. So, if you're playing any other scenario, it doesn't matter. If you're playing the winter ones, it matters a lot.
And does it though, Stuart? Because if you're playing the winter ones, it's like 95% chance to just be heavy snow, and then 5% chance to not be.
I mean, it
and
was.
then,
But you have to hope for that
Yeah, that's
5%
true.
of not heavy
Oh,
snow. Come on.
there was so much snow. We didn't
There's
move
so
our
much
trains
snow.
at all.
We didn't have a
I
single
do like, and
telegraph.
this is the kind of thing where
I love that,
Yeah.
actually.
this is the kind of thing as well where like the game is a little bit like too granular,
Yeah.
as we say, in that like it has a rule where if like it rains, such and such happens, it slows things down, and if you get 2 turns of light rain in a row, then that counts as 1 turn of rain for determining like your flood check or whatever. And it's like, okay, yeah, because there's light rain,
But
snow,
that's how
heavy
weather works.
snow, and
And-
it's like, oh my god, buddy, this doesn't need to have this much.
Yeah, but that's the poetry of wargaming, is that moment where you can feel actual weather on a table through mathematics. Is like, it's beautiful. All right. There's always a bit of asymmetry involved in such games. And I think in Army of the Heartland, one of the ways it rears its head is in unit breakdown. Confederate troops are weaker, but there are much more of them, which means, for example, that the step losses will hit the Union much harder.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, absolutely. It's. I think we really bounced off it at first when we found that out. We were sort of like, oh my god, my Confederate leader here has like 6 counters, and they're all 5, like 4 or 5 strength. And then Stuart's Union leaders he has 3 counters, and both of us will take a step loss in a combat, which means that like his 10 strength counters will half in strength, whereas like my 5 strength counters will go down to 3 strength. And that feels like, what? What is happening here? But
And I think it is specifically that the Confederates are like brigades and the Union are like corps or something.
Yeah,
Like it is just a structural difference in there.
yeah,
Which
but
some games do as like a bit of like fun, where you're like, the Confederacy grouped their cavalry as brigades, so we put them like this way. But like in this one, because of the way the step losses works, it suddenly like really matters, as if like that would.
But then
It's
I think it's relatively elegant when you think about it, because at the end of each turn you get reinforcements and you can reflip your step losses. So the Union get a lot more back. Like if they can like, if say both sides can only flip 1 unit back, the Union will get 5 strength back, whereas the Confederates will get 2 strength back. So I think it does balance itself out like that quite nicely. It is wild though, as like because like the combat tables are not asymmetric to reflect this. It's interesting, and I think it's a definite choice. Like, yeah,
I think if it had a slightly more asymmetric actual combat loss system, or if the combat losses were a little bit more detailed, or had more of a potential asymmetry, because I think it doesn't work as well if it's just like, oh, we both each take 1 step loss in a combat, or we take the same number of step losses consistently in a combat, then I don't think it works as well. So I think it's a cool idea. And I think there's...
And things like supply hit you harder.
Some interesting implications to it. I'm not wholly convinced it works, but it is more interesting than when I first looked at it, and I was like, what the fuck is this?
Exactly. I think our initial impression was like, okay, that's wild. But then we have come around to a bit, but yeah, we're not convinced by it.
I do want to say, like, I think the combat is really cool in a way because it's surprisingly simple, which I love in an operational game, particularly like a game that has so much else going on. Because you don't have to do combat ratios, which people who listen, Pierre and I do not like combat ratios.
Yeah.
We just
Gross.
hate doing ratios. We are arts majors, please. So instead you just calculate your total strength.
I feel you.
You calculate your strength and you roll your combat result. The mad thing in it is that each scenario has a like modifier DRM to combat to reflect the era of the war you're fighting in. So like, because the combat results goes from like 1 to 40 or something, and you're rolling like a d6. So you'd be like, so I got like +1 for my combat, and I'm on a column shift to this strength, and I get +3 for my general, and then I get +9 because we're playing Stones Rivers. Then
because I have more horses than you, I'll have another.
But there's method to the madness, though. There's obvious
there
method to the
actually
madness.
was. There genuinely was.
Yeah, the cavalry one is a bit tedious because you do have to calculate, like, again, it's granular. So it's like, okay, so I have more cavalry strength, so I get the cavalry modifier. I have 2 more cavalry units than you do, so you get -2. And it's like, okay, but then you just roll a d6, you calculate your result, and your opponent calculates your result, and then you just apply them to each other. So you're like, I do 2 step losses and 4 retreats. And you're like, I do 2 step losses and 3 retreats. And you're like, okay, so we both do 2 step losses, and then we do the absolute
Differences.
value of the retreats.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
we subtract them, and then whoever's losing has to retreat the difference. And you're like, great.
Mhm.
It's surprisingly nice. It's great to
And
see.
some of the results have a star, which means that the enemy has to make like a morale check, and it's quite fun.
And if you,
like, it's chaotic.
I also like if you roll a 6, you have to check if your general gets wounded. So your general is more likely to
Yeah.
get wounded in the battle you've won, which I like.
As we mentioned earlier.
Yeah,
So cool.
so that's a really cool, because often it's like you roll badly and badness
Yeah.
like compounds, but in this case it's like
Yeah.
you've done really well. Your general went too far to the front and he got shot.
He got arrogant, Another thing is that the Confederate troops have a higher movement rating, which means that they can sort of take advantage of the game's initiative management system, which you sort of alluded to earlier, Pierre, but you didn't get to the crunch of that.
So the movement system, I'll describe like the movement points, and then I think Stuart can get into the initiative sort of management system. But the movement points, I think the Union has a strict sort of 66% movement points compared to the Confederates. So like if you roll for movement and you are oh god, you're gonna make me and you roll 100 movement points for the Confederates. If you roll the same number as the Union, you'll get 66 movement points. There's a pretty wild difference. But as Stuart mentioned earlier, there are 3 tables that you're moving on. I think not 3 tables. There's 6 different.
It's like 6 tables, yeah.
Yeah, 6 different tables.
3 would have been too easy.
Right? Yeah, 6 different full tables that you're moving on, and that's determined. The one you roll on is determined by, I think, Stuart, tell me if I'm wrong, the general's movement rating. So like a cavalry leader, the amount of initiative that you've put in, right?
So one of the rows is the Union general's movement
There you
rating.
go. Yeah.
And the column is the general's movement rating, and the row is the roll.
Yes, exactly. And the table itself is the initiative amount that you've put into. And Stuart, do you want to get into like the initiative chart, I guess, or like the bidding?
And I will say, just so people know, like the movement ratings range from you fail to activate so badly that your general is made inactive, and you'll have to spend war effort points to reactivate them on a future turn, to 30 movement points.
Yeah.
But often you're going to get like 5.
Something in between.
And you'll get 5, and it's snowing, so each hex costs 2. Like it's
Oh yeah, when it's snowing, you can't use roads, so each hex.
But I love snow. I love snow.
And it's like,
I love snow.
There were definitely turns where we were like, well, I technically rolled movement points, but I can't actually move anywhere because there's no minimum 1 hex move rule, so I'm just stuck.
Oh, that could be a nice little touch.
You get pretty stuck there. So at the start of each turn, you're gonna bid to see who goes first, and you'll have a scenario set bid value, which sometimes are symmetrical and sometimes are asymmetrical. So in like Stones River, the Union gets 5 to the Confederacy's 4, and you will both blind bid your kind of initial initiative for and whoever bids the most goes first. It has incredibly punishing rules for if you bid 0 or you pass. So you almost never want to do that. I guess in the big 1863 campaigns, you might both agree to just like, this turn we don't do anything. But if you bid 0, you don't activate. So, and then there's no tiebreaker. You just have to keep rebidding, basically, until if you tie like 3 times in a row, whoever has the more war effort points has to go or something. Yeah. But basically, you're going to bid an amount, and then the person who wins the bid has to spend that many points, and then that number for the first turn, and then that many points will determine which of the movement tables they roll on. Higher is better to get more movement points. And then the other person will go, and the person who goes second gets to spend however many they want. And then the first person will go again if they still have points to spend. And then the second person will go. And there's rules that you can't get more than 2 back-to-back turns. Yeah. So you can't just have like one person spends all their initiative and the other person spends 1.4 times. It has rules to stop you doing that. Not that I think you would achieve very much, because 1 point on the one movement chart is
I was just going to contextualize that. Like, if you put 1 point, if you bid 1, your average movement as a Union soldier will be like 4 hexes, or for Confederates it will be 6. Whereas if you bid 2, the average movement is 8 and 12, and 3 it's like 8, 12 and 18, and it goes up like that. Like, it's big changes in movement for the amount of bids. So you could have, like, as the Confederates, you could be like, I really need this, and we're just going to bid 4, all 4 in one turn, and then just send it and just go for it, Or you do what we usually did, which was like Union does 3, I do 2, they do 2, I do 2, And that still has that sort of variability, which is quite nice.
And I think the thing that I liked about it is I found the GCACW thing very annoying, where the Confederacy just always moves further.
Yeah.
In this case, I still have a small gripe with it, but I think it's interesting when, like in Stones River, the Union is on the offensive and the Confederacy has the better movement table. So the Union generally has to spend more initiative to equal what the Confederacy can move.
Yeah.
And I think it really felt like it captured the difficulty in being on the offensive and in launching an invasion, and the kind of natural advantage of being the defender and being on home terrain was that Pierre could more easily go second and still kind of match my movement, versus I felt like I had to spend large points. And it kind of also made me think about, like, maybe I do want to just burn 5 on the first turn and actually move far, particularly when I was marching in the fucking snow.
Yeah, exactly.
You know,
Exactly.
like there are turns where you're like, actually, I might need to like spend a lot of points and give up my ability to react because
really
I
dumb.
need to get that one big push.
It sounds really dumb, but like it feels like you're really seizing the initiative, you know? Like
Yeah.
like it really feels like
Yeah, whereas
like,
whereas some systems like initiative is basically like a die roll, and you're just
Yeah,
like,
or
it's not
it's
seizing the
determined by
initiative as much as
exactly.
the initiative falling on your laps,
Yeah.
and you're just like, all right, I'll get the initiative.
Like GCACW's initiative feels more like a chit cup pull.
Yeah.
Like it feels like it's kind of that random. The fate is determining who's going next. Versus like this really does, because you have this bidding, you have this resource, and you are playing a bit of a bidding mind game, as you always are when you're doing bidding.
It's nice that it's a decision.
Yeah, it is like, it's both how much can I beat him, like how do I need to win this, and if I do need to win this, by how much. And particularly when like it's asymmetric, so as the Union I have more, it's like I can win this always. I know I can win
and
this.
you can move further than me, you know, as versus the Confederacy. And
and I can do a big first move, and that encourages you to like your first attack is going to be the bigger move usually, and then the second one will be a smaller reaction. So it feels like I'm launching a big campaign and then I'm reacting, and that feels really interesting. And I really liked it. I think I had a second thought there, and it's escaped me.
Well, overall you seem super positive, and I gotta say, like, as much as it sounds like a heavy game, it also sounds like something that you want to just like get the rules to and just like sort of like explore it. Like, it sounds fascinating. One thing that you really didn't seem to enjoy, though, are the victory conditions. Like, I know that before we recorded this, Stuart, you used the term bland, and as we've said many times here, victory conditions feel like a central part of a game's thesis. So do you think that Prados kind of dropped the ball on that? Is that like because like the game tries to represent too much? Like, what's the problem with those victory conditions?
It's way too. Basically, there is a victory condition, which is you have to take the enemy's capital city functionally. I mean, they're not actually the capitals, but you have to take. I think it's Chattanooga for the Union and Nashville for the Louisville. I think for the Confederacy. And if you can control both cities, so you take the enemies and don't lose yours, then you win the game. And that's kind of it. Like, the next system basically is the tiebreaker function that you get VPs for units killed, which I don't generally even like at an operational scale, because especially in the American Civil War, whoever's on the offensive always takes higher casualties. Like, that's just how war was fought at the time. And games generally are very good at replicating that. Like, that's something you will see again and again in American Civil War games. Going on the attack fucking sucks. And that, is true here as well. It feels very, very good in that regard. But then that means that, like, why would you attack? Like, you need strategic objectives to explain why you would ever go on the offensive. Otherwise, the Union would never win the war, because they would just sit in Kentucky and wait. Like, the impetus is on them. And it also feels weird because it has these two huge Rick Barber maps that are lovely. And Louisville and Chattanooga are on the eastern map. Yeah. And so it's like, why would you do shit with the western fucking map, right? Like, who gives a shit about Corinth, Mississippi?
Yeah.
It's not worth anything except in one of the small scenarios that cares about the western map. Like, I think some of the small scenarios have their own victory conditions, but some of them don't. Like, we played Stones River, and Stones River doesn't have a different set of victory conditions, but it is like, I'm sure it's technically possible for the Union to get to Chattanooga if the Confederacy just walked out of their way and you rolled good movement and it wasn't snowing, you could get to Chattanooga in 3 turns from Nashville. But I don't think it's going to happen ever,
Yeah.
you know?
You're going
So
for
then
the
it's like,
bypass
what are
there.
we doing?
Like,
You know,
yeah.
because like I took Murfreesboro, like after my disastrous early defeat where the poor Rock of Chickamauga got pretty much obliterated when I landed into an ill-advised attack. I did like circle around Pierre. Also, attrition losses don't count for victory points suffered from loss of supply. So I completely obliterated the Confederate army by cutting his supply lines, and I lost the game.
Yeah.
And I don't want to make it sound like I'm just
Because
bitter about
it
this.
was too
because
clever. It was too
Yeah.
clever.
It just felt weird. It felt really weird that it's like if we had played even one more
Yeah,
turn,
no,
Pierre would have had no generals on the map.
But we didn't.
And it was
though.
like,
So,
but he had like one more step. He'd eliminated one more step than I had, so he wins. And it's like
in brave
doing
battle, none of that. None
Yeah.
of that.
crushed one more step than you. Yeah.
Creeping behind your lines and
like there are games where I think that would make sense, like in a game that's about like a more chivalric or heroic era of warfare where like what you're earning is reputation and glory in
Yeah.
battle, and that like social cachet is what is important. And something like attrition losses aren't meaningful. Like in a levy and campaign game that had attrition, it wouldn't make sense for them to have victory points because who gives a fuck if some levies starve in a field? That's not worth anything to anyone.
It's so true.
But in a game like this, it really feels like there should be more on the map that matters, I think, to a degree. Or it should just be one map is the other thing, where it's like, why do we even have the Western map? Is it just except that Rick Barber drew lovely maps and we wanted those scenarios for the Western half?
Yeah.
But so that kind of stuff.
and they're
I think,
lovely. They're really lovely.
they're very nice. So I think that aspect of it doesn't quite fit, and it doesn't really feel like the scenario design for a lot of it is kind of up to the stuff, is as good as it needs to be for the rest of the game, which, as you say, we think we like the system a lot. I would say I think it's far from perfect. I think there's a lot of flaws. There's a lot of little things that are off about it. And I think if we played it more, some of them would come more to the forefront. I've seen people not liking the boat rules and the train rules, and I would absolutely believe that they're not great. We didn't end up using the trains at all because it snowed the whole time, and the trains can't move in the snow. So that kind of stuff, I feel like as worth considering that like when we play something like OCS, we're playing version 4 of OCS now, right?
Exactly.
We're not playing 1992 OCS. We're not playing original GCACW. We're playing Lee versus Grant revised into GCACW, and then the MMP era of GCACW revising that even further, streamlining, cleaning up a lot of that game. And then there is we are playing technically the second edition of Army of the Heartland, which came out in like 2004, but I don't think it's that much of a revision to it, and it hasn't seen that same iteration and revision and cleaning up that I think if it had received something like OCS has, this would be a much better system, a much cleaner system.
Those DNSig rule sets have this quality of being like fine-tuned to like a perfect degree of like the rule book to OCS is super long, but it does feel manageable, even though it's insanely like it's 60 pages or something.
My counter to this, and I agree with all those points, but my counter to this is that last year at PunchCon I saw a copy of this for £20, whereas I am never going to find a full box OCS game for anything close to affordable. Like that counts for a lot. Especially these days.
For sure.
Like it counts for a lot. Like it's an old game. It's easy to pick up. There's lots of copies on Overnight. There's lots of copies on BGG. And
people don't. But overall, John Prados' designs seem undervalued, and I don't think we should be saying this too loud because maybe like people will be like
John Prados stock is
buying them all. Yeah. The John Prados stock will just like skyrocket. But every time I'm like, oh, this isn't that expensive, and I feel like maybe it's like there is a bit of a kitchen sink makeshift like designing like approach to his work that doesn't necessarily like sing with the grog nerds who just want it to be like perfect. But it does make for games that look interesting, like really interesting.
Quite Bergian approach.
While we're on the topic of the presentation, we're gonna have to address the elephant in the room here. There's just a whole lot of Confederate flags all over this thing. Let's just say the box itself seems to have picked a side, and I'm not sure it aligns with Prados' worldview, but that box is as its views of its own.
So what I would say,
I'd say
yeah, go ahead, Stuart. Go ahead, Stuart.
I bought this game solely on the name and the cover. That's the whole reason I bought this game, because it is called Army of the Heartland, the Army of Tennessee's campaigns, not the Tennessee. We're Army of Tennessee here, and it has 3 Confederate flags on the front of
Hell
it.
yeah.
It has blazoned on the back, but behind the image
Yeah.
is the battle flag of Northern Virginia, which is a completely anachronistic flag to have for the Army of
Hell
Tennessee,
yeah.
who did not use that flag during these
Yahoo!
campaigns, or basically ever. And then in the picture, we have a Confederate brigade marching forward, I think charging forward, and they have the actual Confederate flag, the stars and bars, and they have the actual kind of the Southern Cross flag that they would have actually would have been brought by. I think they're one of the Kentucky Confederate brigades. I think it's their specific flag, because there's all these really interesting regional specific or unit specific flags that you don't see in games very often.
I quite like that.
So
That's
it's
fair,
I
to
think
be fair.
it's
Yeah.
I think it's one of those. And so it's just like, wow, there's a lot of Confederate
then-
happening on the
and
front
then
of this
Stuart-
game. And I was looking at games for this series. I was like, yeah, we got to get the game
Let's just-
that's named after a Confederate army with Confederate flags.
You receive the game then, and then you open the box, and you realize that the off-map, like army display screen for the Confederates has no less than 17 Confederate flags on it. Like
It's
and
quite
a
and
nice
a little portrait
portrait.
of Jeff
It
Davis, I
needs-
think.
Be
Portrait
clear,
of Jeff
guys. It needs to be clear.
It's wild.
Some people need the point hammered
What
on.
I love
They
is that
don't-
it's got the boxes themselves
clear.
all have a flag on each box.
Yeah.
And then, just for good measure, in the corner they just put another flag there, another Confederate flag. It's just a lot, you know. It's just a lot.
Yeah.
It's a lot. It's a
Yeah.
lot of Confederate flag. And they're all battle flags, obviously, which, again, are not the right flag for this
Doesn't
theater.
make any sense. We've been over this.
But the regional flags are interesting, though.
Yeah, and we don't get much of that. But I really want more regional flags in these games. It adds so much flavor. Like, it's cool. Like, it's
There's so many flags. You can use so many
and
flags.
they're so varied as well. It's I don't know.
And like their Confederate flags are across the board, kind of bad.
Oh yeah.
But like the regional weird niche flags don't have that same association of like anti-US civil rights movement like the battle
Yeah.
flag does.
Yeah.
Like they haven't been picked up in the same way by the white supremacist movements, and
No,
they don't have
there's
that
still history.
same. Yeah, they're still like kind of obscure enough that I think they fit more in the realm of like, well, you are playing a historical game.
Mhm.
And those symbols are a little bit less like immediately like, what the fuck is this? Why is this here?
Yeah.
And you
It's
can
less of a
better fit.
pickup
And the
truck
argument of
game.
like, this is representative of the history and of the region in a way that something like the battle flag in this case isn't even accurate and is a big old white supremacist symbol on it,
Yeah.
which is
And that's
yikes.
that's
I
the
will
core
say
for me.
so.
Like, why use this flag?
Yeah.
Why? Like, what are you doing here? Because it doesn't make sense here.
And yeah, that is very odd to me. And then the framing of it being the Army of Tennessee is just a little bit weird in that, like, I don't know, it just kind of doesn't. First of all, we said like they're the Army of Tennessee in the second half of this, they were the Army of Mississippi before. So it's not like it is not even a coherent name for the whole period the game covers. And it's just like, why the Confederate named army is always a bit like,
Yeah.
you see it a lot, and that inherent sympathy with the South that I think is fundamentally undeserved. I will say, like, there is a pretty big historical background section in the book that I was, from the vibe, expecting to be quite rough.
Yeah.
And is actually pretty good. I mean, it's not the greatest historical background you're ever going to read. It's from 1996, so it's very American Civil War general history from 1996, but it isn't, egregious in any way. Like, it's a perfectly reasonable accounting of
not
the events that happened. It doesn't really feel like it's, coming up to bat for Bragg or Davis or any of these guys.
It's not like the historiography has changed much in 30 years. Like, it helps.
Oof. It's all just Shelby Foote, right? No, I think actually you do see some Shelby Foote influence in this, and that General Forrest is the best general on the field. He's got a 6 battle rating, so on that D6 he will always succeed,
And he's really strong.
which is some pure Shelby Foote. And it is also, like, to put it in its context, the previous game in this series is called The Campaigns of Robert E. Lee. So again, Southern Confederate viewpoint. And then the third game is called Look Away, which, if you don't know, is a line from the song Dixie. It's from the chorus. So there is a real Confederate perspective bent to the titling of these games. I would be curious how much of that, like, well, we can't ask him now, but like if that was John Prados' vision or if that was kind of the titles they thought would sell. Although, like, the first two are Clash of Arms. Look Away is actually an Against the Odds magazine game. So they are different publishers
Prados started
across the
working
series.
a lot more with Against the Odds, I think, in his later life.
Yeah.
Very different arts in general to that.
I would say on that, well, so on the presentation, one last thing is that this game is fucking enormous. It has 2 giant Rick Barber maps and 2 very large side army displays that together are at least another map in size.
Yeah.
And if you want to set them not directly opposite each other so you can't see as easily, then you're looking at basically a 4-map kind of table situation.
Huge.
Which to me is probably one of the biggest barriers to me actually wanting to play this game routinely. There's no way I'm playing this game solo. I have no space for it. The only way I can really play it is on Vassal. It said the Vassal mod is quite good. It has all the components in it, but they've only done the setup for about 2 scenarios.
Yeah.
So if you want to play it, then you've got to go through and actually do the setup yourself, which isn't the end of the world, but it is a bit tedious. So that kind of barrier to actually playing it. This is a, American basement kind of game.
Yeah. Or a convention.
For someone who lives in a small Korean apartment, it's a challenge.
Convention games.
So what I would be very curious in trying Look Away, the 3rd game in the series, though.
Yes,
It's something I want to try and track down a copy of because it's a magazine game from Against the Odds. It's 1 map. They shrank the side displays to just being a single card, like a single sheet of A4. So you've got 2 sheets of A4 and 1 map, much more manageable size. It's on the Fall of Atlanta, which is a campaign I think is really interesting, and I would like to see more treatments of. There are a few out there, but the GCSW game is notoriously complex. So I would like to see more on like one of, I think, the most crucial campaigns of the American Civil War that can be overlooked at times. My instinct is more that I would like to track down and try that one more, and it's also the 3rd iteration. So if there is a more polished version of this system, it's going to be Look Away.
I'm sure they rewrote the rules for it as well.
Yeah, the rules are rewritten, and I think it's from 2007. So I think it's the last. It's post-states the revised edition of this as well. So I am curious to try that. It does not have Rick Barber maps, so the maps are not as pretty. The counters are quite nice. Whoever did the counters did a good job,
but that's
the map is a bit bland.
For me, that's Against the Odds. They have really nice counters, but the maps are maybe a bit washed out. But this Rick Barber map for Army of the Heartland, I sometimes bounce off of them slightly from a usability standpoint. They tend to be quite busy. This one is so clean. I really like it.
That's what I was gonna say. Yeah, it because of the coloring system for each X, it makes it more readable. Like while still having that very hand drawn, like organic. Like I just love how you can get lost in a Rick Barber map. It's an experience on all into itself.
You really get that vibe, but it's also very easy to play with. I find, which is lovely.
I was impressed by that little bit of graphic design, which means that like it's still a Rick Barber map, but it feels a little more easy to use. So any like short final thoughts on the game? Because we've been going at it for a while, and I think we've said a lot about this, and I think some people might track down a copy of Army of the Heartland after hearing you guys talk about it. But yeah, final impressions?
I really like it. I think it's a good game. I think it's interesting. I don't know when I'm going to play it again or if I'm going to play it again, as Stuart said. As you've mentioned, Alexandre, for me, it's a convention game. I live in the UK. I live in a flat in the UK with a small round table, so I'm not going to be playing this at home. I'd like to play this at a convention. I think you could play it in an evening at a convention on big tables, maybe after another big game before that. I love it. I'd love to try it again. It does some really weird stuff that I want to dig into more. I think one more play would be enough for me, but I want to sort of dig into it. Yeah.
Stuart?
I would feel pretty similar about this. I enjoyed it way more than I thought I would, even from reading the rulebook. The rulebook is, I wouldn't say it's bad necessarily, but like it's a very wargame rulebook. It's dense. It's structured in a slightly weird. It's just in that sequence of play structure that can be kind of easy to read, but that makes it a pain to look stuff up. And there's so much little stuff happening in it. Then I was reading it, I was like, I couldn't necessarily see what the game was in it because it has that issue where like all things are kind of presented to you equally, and you're like, is this system as important as that system? But then when you play it, it actually plays surprisingly cleanly. The core of it plays quite nicely. It is really engaging. The decision spaces are really nice once you kind of got it down. And I remember thinking, because we played it first, and then there was that huge gap, and I had to relearn it, which was a chore. But then once we got back into it, we actually settled back into the game surprisingly quickly.
Easily, yeah.
So I felt like that was a really enjoyable experience, and I had a lot more fun with it than I thought I would. I do still think like relearning the game is a big task. And again, like I had fun. I enjoyed playing it. I don't know if I'm going to keep this copy because I currently live in Korea and I have to like get rid of stuff sometimes. There's no way I'm playing it here. Although, as Pierre said, copies of this are pretty easy to find, so I might end up picking up another one.
Yeah,
I have the Ziploc edition. I don't even have a box. I don't know when I would play it again, but I do think the system is cool, and I think it's something that's worth exploring, particularly if any of this stuff sounds interesting to you. And if you're just like interested in game design and interesting game decisions, I think this is a really fascinating take on this period. I think it probably is, again, I think probably Pierre and I would agree that we like experiences and interesting ideas and enjoying like the kind of vibe of a game or a game's argument, and aren't super worried about like how competitive it is.
Yeah, fully. Yeah, absolutely.
And I would say,
I think we all agree with that.
Yeah. So if you are like someone who really worries about like that side of things, I don't know if this game is particularly balanced or like an interesting competitive thing, or even like if you're I've seen some people complain, like really care about it capturing exactly how the history went. As you said at the start, sandbox, not simulation. So I think bearing in mind your own taste on those matters, this is a really cool game that's not received a lot of attention and an interesting system. And as I said, I would quite like to try the third one. And I'm not very interested in campaigns for Robert E. Lee, just I think from the title alone. But
from what you just said there, Stuart, like it's the perfect foil to Grand Campaigns of the American Civil War. Like if you like that sort of GCACW stuff, go for that. And then there is this as if you don't like that, and that's quite nice that this exists.
It has made me very excited for it. There is a separate Clash of Arms operational American Civil War system that I want to try at some point, and this has made me like kind of really curious to see what that one's like now. Like, what's the other Clash of Arms operational game like, and how does it compare to this one and GCACW? So it is cool to see, and it's something I would like to see more of, because I feel like GCACW kind of takes up all the oxygen in the room in operational ACW
for sure.
now.
Yeah.
It's kind of dominant one. You kind of have, there's nothing else even really competing with it. And it is something where I would like to see more takes. And I think something like this is a really cool alternative way of looking at what operational strategic, because it is a little bit more strategic. I know we said the scale, but it's more like OCS's scale, where turns are half a week and each X is 5 miles. So it's more zoomed out. And so I'd like to see more takes on that and see more of what designers think operational Civil War should look like. Yeah.
Now we're dreaming up games, but we also, what are we doing next? Like games that exist, actual games that exist. Do we have any plans?
Next episode, we're going to design our own game. No.
This is what it all led to.
Yeah. This has all been hype. P500 our game. The next, Kickstarter. We should be kickstarting this ourselves. We're big enough.
Miniatures.
It'll come with a bust of Jefferson Davis. The next game the plan is the next game to play is going to be a big boy, Mark Simonich's U.S. Civil War. We're going to play the 1862 scenario.
Very exciting.
To kind of look back on the year we've just finished.
I've been clipping that.
I've been clipping that. About it. I'm really excited for this one.
Yeah. I've heard so much about it, and Simonich is a designer that I really respect. So I can't wait to hear your thoughts on it. So, well, thank you again. That was a great conversation. That was Army of the Heartland by John Prados, published by Clash of Arms Games in 1996. We'll see you all next time, and in the meantime, stay safe.
Goodbye.
31st day of December, 3,000 dressed in blue and gray, all sons of the Heavenly Father, lay in a watery grave, and the river runs red. The river runs red. One shot woke the Tennessee morning. Soon fire and smoke filled the sky. Then rain came down with no warning. As sorrow fell down from all sides. The river runs red, the river runs red. No winners or losers when you count the dead. We watch it roll by, we all bow our heads. The guns have gone silent, but the river runs red. Now Rogers was from Alabama, and Thomas and old New York town. But soon they would die like blood brothers in the stream where their souls would flow down. The river runs red, the river runs red. No winners or losers when you count the dead. We watch it roll by, we all bow our heads. The guns have gone silent, but the river runs red. Some say you could see red for miles, and it flowed that way so many years. Now the water looks clean and untainted. The Stones River will never run clear, 'cause the river runs red, the river runs red. No winners or losers when you count the dead. We watch it roll by, we all bow our heads. The guns have gone silent, but the river runs red.